good lunch? Okay, how many of you are feeling sleepy now after lunch? She must be feeling sleepy after lunch. Okay. So the best way to not feel sleepy after lunch, especially listening to other people talk, is to engage all of you in this panel discussion rather than four of us doing the talking. Does that sound like a good plan? Or you're hating me because, but remember, we are here not to hate each other, but love each other. Learn how to love each other. Okay, so I would first like to ask all of you your impressions so far after the couple of sessions we had this morning. Your quick thoughts, even the speeches that you heard before lunch and the discussion that happened prior to that with ACU and British Council staff, and what you learned from each other during the icebreaker, little bit of impressions from your own side. And also, some of you did come up to me and some others during the lunchtime, raising some controversial issues. So you're also free to share those thoughts, even if they are controversial, things related to, of course, Gandhian philosophy and issues related to the theme of this conference, inspiring global citizens. So who would like to go first? Thoughts, comments? Anything that comes to your mind? And I would request all of you, you have introduced yourself, but now as you are speaking, just quickly introduce yourself once again.
The UK. And yes, I think we had an amazing session this morning. It was very thought provoking, only because we looked at issues not in isolation but holistically, and that's what kind of stood out. Right from knowing each other to knowing about the inspiring work that each of us do in our own little ways to bring about a social change is something that stood out. But I think we discussed very briefly during lunch about the other side of Gandhi, where we see him as this beacon of peace and as this hero of of a lifetime. But at the same time, there's so much controversial issues around his life, around some racial allegations against him about gender discrimination that he is allegedly supposed to have committed. So that kind of, I would like to see whether or how fair is it to judge the historical figures of the past in terms of today's moral and ethical standards. So I think if we could, touch up a little bit on that, that would be good, because it's not just Gandhi, but heroes of the past, like so many of them have the other side to them. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Riddhi. We all have our clay feet, right? And I think our Dean Sudarshan, who gave the keynote this morning, he wonderfully, situated Gandhi in his talk, historically situated, and did touch upon these controversial issues that you're raising, and with regards to his own experiments with truth, and also the cultural background that he is coming from, and also to look at him within that historical context rather than judging him from our contemporary moral values. But with regards to the theme of this conference, I think there is no doubt the fact that Gandhian philosophy of ahimsa, satyagraha, and sarvodaya, the three main concepts that Gandhi is very much famous for, non-violence, and satya in it means truth, right? Satyagraha, seeking truth, and also through a mode of truth and justice, of course, through a mode of non-violent resistance. For sarvodaya means welfare for all. Okay, something which connects with, very much connects with our theme of Commonwealth futures and global citizens. And I think nobody would disagree to that. And if you have any other thoughts, you're welcome to share. But I think this is something, we are at a historical period and a stage of human civilization where we need to think about Sarvodaya not just with regards to humans, beyond humans, right? Because the sustainability of the entire planet Earth is in question right now. So I think in that sense, Gandhian philosophy is extremely helpful for all of us to think about education, to think about change within ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we not just relate to each other in terms of relations with other human beings, but how we relate to even non-human beings and the planet Earth. In India, we had a long tradition where people believe very strongly that there is a life force even in within things that we consider as absolutely inanimate, even in a stone or any other, life. There's a life force that runs through each and every organism, each and every tree or vegetation, and fish, animals, and even those which are underwater, those who live underwater, and those which are something we don't consider. Even a rock has a life force inside. And this is something which have been indigenously very, very close to the indigenous beliefs of people within the Indian subcontinent and among many indigenous communities around the world, I think. And something which Gandhi also promoted very much. So I would now like to, I think, really introduce with all of you one of our faculty here, Professor Padyumna Purahit, who is also a faculty associated with our JGU Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies. You haven't heard from him yet, so I would invite my colleague Pradyumna to share some of his thoughts on Gandhian philosophy, and then I would also request our ACU colleagues to share their thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mosmi, for the inaugural words of this panel discussion or a session. Today, I'll be speaking on specifically that what was Gandhi's messages to the students. And it's quite a controversial deed in itself, because if you think that Gandhi would have inspired people for revolution or, go and participate in civil disobedience movement, right? Or he would have inspired the students' community to hit the street, then Gandhi is a big disappointment. He didn't do any of that, right? Gandhi, since beginning and by till the end of the freedom struggle, always insisted that the political space is not suited for the students, right? So the best space for the students is the social sphere, right? And interestingly, when I'm talking about students with the general notion of patriarchy, it's talking about the male students, right? Later on, I'll come to that how he addresses some of the letters that were addressed to him for molestations from the Punjab University in Lahore. Now, his advice to students is 7 or 8-fold. Although Gandhi has written in different varieties about education and different point in his life, the important time when he was writing for the students or about the students was around 1926, 1927, while writing in Young India. And the other literature that is available to us about students where Gandhi is addressing or perhaps in direct question and answer with the students by responding their letters or in a press interview. So, and this is around 1938, right? So we have to understand that how the Gandhi's view has changed from 27 to 38, and what he believed in 27 isn't that true in 38. And by Gandhi's own words, he says that I'm a person who commits mistakes, and not just mistakes, honest mistakes, right? And those honest mistakes are also both philosophical and literary. So he says that even if after a time when I'm dead, if you are going through my works, don't rely on what I've said on an earlier date. Always try to rely what I said on a later date, because perhaps by that time I've changed my view, right? And he says that even that view shouldn't be accorded as universal one, right? So not in defense of Gandhi, but still in the voice of Gandhi, if Gandhi was alive today, I very much believe that Gandhi would have shamelessly admitted the wrongs or the words that he has uttered, right? Whether it is towards women, also a particular race, right? So what makes Gandhi Gandhi is that shameless attitude of coming out and say that that's what I believed and that's what I said, and I'm sorry I was wrong and I apologize for it, right? That's one of the major takeaway from Gandhi, that it's not that in a particular context you came to believe something, right? And Gandhi himself admits a lot of times that he is the product of what his education was, and thus he tries to prescribe certain form of education as well in a small compilation or in sort of a book that Gandhi wrote. It's called Nai Talim, which means a new education. Even his idea of a perfect education should resembled as Ram Rajya, but it's better translated as the rule of righteousness, right? So let me tell you what are the 7 or 8 topics on which Gandhi generally gave advice to the students, and a little bit contents of how he is engaging and what's wrong in that kind of an advice if we look at today. So first of all, who is a student for Gandhi? A student, in eyes of Gandhi is, the word he used is brahmacharya, or he equates the same word to sannyasi. Now the word brahmacharya and sannyasi in Gandhi's word, if I can translate it, is a celibate, right? So Gandhi says that the life of a student should be a celibate one, right? Now what do you mean by that when he says it's celibate one? Here he has given his advice in 2 parts, right? The first advice is a religious one, that how a student conducts itself a religious life. So what should be the prime religion of a student? So for Gandhi, the most important religion, or the word dharma, which comes again and again in Gandhi's reading, even if you are reading in English. So the word dharma is a word which cannot be translated accurately. I think it's a parallel to the Latin term jus, J-U-S, right? Where you can't exactly appropriate and translate it. Sometimes it means your moral duties. Sometimes it also means religion. Sometimes it will mean your work, right? So rather than calling that, Gandhi uses this word dharma ambiguously, he's always using it with quite a caution and in a particular context. Now here, Gandhi, when he invokes dharma for the students, first of all is invoking as religion. Now, while he's imparting this message to the students, and this is 1927 in Young India while he's addressing, so for Gandhi, what's important here is that how religious education is imparted in educational system. So Gandhi was opposed of a traditional Western secular education in the university or in a school system, right? And he gave 2 reasons. So as we understand secularism in the West, where we say that, okay, there should be a separation of church from the polity, that's what the classical way how we understand it. For Gandhi, it's the other way around. He says that in secularism or any form of polity where it's deemed to be secular, the polity should be governed by the ethics of religion, right? And doesn't matter what religion it is, right? So in essence, he's trying to say that try to bring all goodness of religion into the politics, right? So a lot of people have criticized Gandhi on this point, that how can you invoke religion which is full of, dogmas, rituals, etc., etc. So Gandhi said that when you have already realized that a religion is full of dogmas and rituals, that means you are educated enough to differentiate which ones are the dogmas and the rituals and separate it from the religion and take the spiritual being and use it as a model of governance. Now, the second point while addressing to the students is that any religion, right, irrespective of having a dogmatic and the spiritual practice, it gives you a sense of discipline. So you don't have to carry out the ritual, you have to just take the discipline from it, right? And that's where he says that two things, again, are important. One is when he's using the word brahmacharya and celibacy, he's using in terms of that absence of lust while you are dedicated towards your studies, right? So he says that you'll regret if once, because you're not student forever. You are student forever in some sense, but what he wanted to say that you're not going to be in a university set up forever in your life. So what he's trying to say that you're going to regret if you don't focus on what ought to be studied, because you're not getting your reading time. If you are, let's say, and this is very controversial, where Gandhi says that, if you think that you can join the freedom movement on the street while neglecting what you ought to have read during that time, right? And it will be a miss, because after that you will never get a chance perhaps to read the same stuff that you were supposed to read before, right? So he's made a clear demarcation of how students ought to behave in university. Now, if we look at this thing in our contemporary troubled times, whether it's in India or in Hong Kong and other places in light of the student protests, right? It's very, it's not disheartening what Gandhi has said, because when he says that the student should belong to the university and not come out of the street, it means he said that the other people who are not students should be on the street, right? And it's the failure of the society in general that they are not able to come on the street. And to fill that void, the students have taken this extraordinary measure of strike and protest on the streets against the government, right? So we always have to read this in that context, because he's constantly saying that the national movement or any sort of movement or disobedience movement is for the people outside the university. But if people outside the university are silent, then what's the choice? Right? So the obvious choice for the student is to fill up that gap. It means that a Gandhian student wasn't a mature student, right? But today's student is mature enough to read Gandhi and go a step ahead from what he prescribed for the students, right? Now, coming back to the religious nature of how students should behave and conduct themselves, he said it for a particular reason. And he said that if students don't understand the religion, because at the time and in the context while he was speaking, the literacy rate was very low. And even if the literacy rate is very high today, there's a difference between, a community of literates and a community of educated people, right? So he says that in order to communicate with masses, right, because they believe it's not individual anymore, because Gandhi is constantly very wary of, while using these contested concepts, such as when he's trying to address to a person or individual or a group or a mass. So he'll use this word masses. That means wherever he's using the word masses, he has already taken away the intellectual agency from the people. Right? It means that whatever the leaders say to the masses, masses will believe in it. So the faith of the masses is always a religious one, right? So he says the real battle is between, depending, doesn't matter which religion you come from, right, is between the misinformation which has been spread by their respective priests of their religion, right, should be ambushed. And they will be only ambushed when the students have acquired a particular amount of religious training while they are students, right? Otherwise, once they graduate and when they start, communicating in a political language with the people, they should know that what's actually been prescribed or how things were. And if you look at, that's exactly our global challenges today. In today's context where people would say that no, religious practices are wrong, we should aspire towards secular practices, disbanning or banning religion from the public space. Now, Gandhi would say that no, you don't have to ban the religious space. Engage with that religious space and bring out that bigotry, rule out that bigotry from the religious space that is present, right? Because it's religion who teaches. Martin Luther King constantly used this, that religions brings out that agape love, that love which is there within ourselves. Now, the second aspect, it is the first one is how he's engaging with religion. The second is he's engaging with the character of a student, right? And one of the important points which he mentions over and over again is of sex education, that how important it is. And he even said that some technical universities or biological sciences departments should actually come together and create experts in sexual education so that they can impart students. And the age that Gandhi suggests is 12 or 13, right? And until they attain their first graduate degree, it should be a compulsory course. Now, the reason why, and that's what's happening today. I mean, it wasn't heard 50 years ago, but Gandhi was forward-looking about it. And he was very particular by saying that this sort of sex education shouldn't be separated on the basis of sexes, that male and the female students are made to sit, in a separate batches, and then this education should be imparted. He said, no, the mutual, respect for biological features can only come when they sit together, and in a school setup, these kind of diktat needs to be provided. Now, the third one is an interesting one where Gandhi is talking about that how a student is going to engage in politics, strikes. Is it okay to, let's say, go on a strike within a university, right? Now, Gandhi is speaking in strictly, now he's responding to various letters where some excesses have been committed by some of the British officials in the university that they are teaching, right? At the same time, he is opposing that a particular cult, which he called, infamously as the Bhagat Singh cult, where people are, taking up arms or resorting to violence to do that. And there is this entire, for 5 or 6 years, there were allegations on Gandhi. Mostly it's whataboutery about that how, because what he did, his actions related to one of the important execution of a radical group, and one of the important person was Bhagat Singh. So he's constantly reminding that since 1921, even if we have known that how brutal the colonial rule is, right? How much violence that we have received. It's not in 1931 that for past 10 years they are aware of, right? But when a resolution of non-violence is made, right, it shouldn't be let go of. So either you let me go, right? If you think that my ways are old, you let me go, or you say what I do. Now, there is this, whenever, Gandhi has this sort of an attitude which is considered very problematic sometimes, that whenever after a point of engagement with Gandhi, that if you sort of disagree again and again, very rationally and very logically, Gandhi is a kind of person who will not engage after a point, right? And his simple way of doing it was that he'll throw tantrums, right? And it's visible if you go through his Gandhian literature. After a point, he'll say that, no, I don't believe in nonsense you're talking. So for Gandhi, talking logically and rationally wasn't a good thing, right? So Gandhi always spoke a language of passion and emotion, right? So we also have to see that, if you're speaking the language of an emotion and passion, and if we are reading Gandhian literature through our intellectual capacities and finding logics and rationals in it, that means we are questioning Gandhi by questions of why he said it and how he said it. Perhaps you're asking the wrong questions, right? Because it wasn't said in a very rational or a logical way, right? So the problem that we have in front of us as students while reading Gandhi is that perhaps we don't have that language to even consider, or we don't have that language to read Gandhi or understand it. So that's where mostly the gap lies in between, right? Another important point that I wanted to bring in front of us was that how Gandhi looked at various social evils, let's say, dowry, expenditure on marriage, As you know, like Gandhi's marriage lasted almost for a month, right? And because of that, he failed his 8th grade, right? And he repeated his 8th grade. I don't know why 8th grade is so famous grade to repeat. I mean, Einstein failed it, Gandhi failed it, I failed it. So, I don't know. So, now, what Gandhi is saying, constantly there is this recurring theme of saying that if you are a student, don't engage, right? And he's saying that the primary responsibility of a student is to read, read, and read, right? Because after that, once you have read, I mean, whatever you are reading, according to Gandhi, is that, your teachers are the best guide, even if they are immoral, right? But you have to pick up morality from the text that has been prescribed, right? So if the text prescribed is a Quran or any of the Gospels that you read, all you have to take from that is that how can you see that the love for all is, presented. So these are, the fundamental messages that he is, transferring to the students. At the same time, when we are looking at Gandhi from some of the lenses, let's say how he addresses the girl students, the controversy lies here that at one point Gandhi said that I think it's the women's fault that they don't wear their clothes to hide their body but to attract, right? And he also used this phrase of Juliet while trying to get dozens of Romeos. So that's what the expression that came. Now, that's where that caveat comes in, right? That if Gandhi was a student of, let's say, Mosumi or some of the other teachers who teach feminist theories in OPGGU, Gandhi would have attended those things, and Gandhi would have, addressed, or perhaps he was alive, he would have engaged with, let's say, Simone de Beauvoir, in a very interesting critical dialogue, and would have accepted the defeat, right? So that form of apology. So we are not saying that what is not important here is Gandhi as a person. Yes, it's important because it's the person and the theorists are, always seen together. But it's also important that what if that person have lived long? Because throughout his life, there's that chain of admitting his own fault, right? And perhaps even taking 180-degree turns on what he believed just because he thinks that, and while apologizing, he says that, yes, I wasn't educated on that, right? And there's this important, anecdote, because Gandhi was quite a vegetarian after his, lot of experiments with his diet. So when he became vegetarian and in Ahmedabad, in ashram where only vegetarian diet was prescribed, so Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was staying, and his someone was born, in let's say west of Afghanistan, who doesn't understand that there is something called vegetarian and non-vegetarian food. Food is food, right? And for him, it was, for first 1 month, it was a very difficult ride that he couldn't, adjust to the food that was offered in Ahmedabad in ashrama. And then someone actually said to Gandhi that, okay, what if we, what's your problem? So Gandhi said that my problem is because there is life in it. And then Gandhi made an exception that, okay, fine, if, the body is also important, so let this person can consume meat. And then someone came to Gandhi on the very same day in the evening that people are angry, but they've come up with a solution. So Gandhi says, educate me. He said, what if the person consumes unfertilized eggs, because then there is no life involved? And Gandhi says yes to it, and writes, and appeal letters that because of the nutrition levels are down, yes, it is okay to consume unfertilized eggs, right? Now this demonstrates, that how even the core or the fundamental principles or Gandhian principles could be challenged, right? And here we are saying that even the idea of truth, the idea of satyagraha, could also have been challenged, right? It would be interesting that how Gandhi would have responded to having a conversation with Frantz Fanon. I mean, we don't know, right? But look at it that, if we understand the Gandhian method, right, of emotion and passion, right, or the parallel language we don't have yet, right? Or perhaps someone has to discover that language, right? Although we are reading Gandhi mostly in perhaps in vernaculars and in English. And Gandhi opposed English education system throughout, and he says that if you think that you're only able to express in English, you are mistaken, because he always believed that education should be imparted in vernacular, because otherwise most of the people, while learning English, waste almost 6 years of their life simply to understand and know how to express in a foreign tongue. So it says that now, and he tells one of his disciples that now you see that if you multiply 6 years into the number of productive years of a student's life is lost just to understand the literature in a different language. So he's also opposed to Sanskrit. I mean, he says that if you have to read the Bhagavad Gita, Gita shouldn't be read in Sanskrit. It's supposed to be read in English. Gandhi never read Gita while he was in India. He read it the very first time when he was in London, and that too in English, right? So, these are the issues. So what we have to pick generally while we are engaging, right? And reading Gandhi in a literal sense is very problematic, but picking the ism or, rather than not reading this in an adjectival form but in a noun form, perhaps would answer some of the doubts. With respect, and now almost while I'll conclude, I would address some of the important controversies that are surrounding, and especially after the Manuben's diary, which has been recently published. We also had one memorial lecture over there on 4th of October, where we actually discussed in length that what it was. One of the takeaways, and I'll simply, these are not my views, but take away from that very conference, is that we are constantly perhaps looking Gandhian life as an experiment. And somewhere we have to draw that distinction that at times it's not an experiment. At times he is also checking himself that whether the experiments holds true the other way, right? So, so when you are experimenting, how do you know that experiment is successful, right? So perhaps in that spirit, we don't know yet because no one understands Gandhi better than the Gandhi himself, and that's what's been said by the other, if we can call Gandhi a mystic in that sense in India, because it's a different language, right? The expression that we have in English don't apply, right? And even the expression that we have in vernaculars, they say something literally, but to express the feelings and the emotion, it's completely different, right? So to sum up, for students, that Gandhi said, right, on that very controversial note, that what they ought to be doing, whether they should be on the street protesting, or whether they should be inside the classrooms, right? Just my take is that if the overall society minus students are not doing anything, perhaps today's students is more mature than what Gandhi anticipated, and perhaps would have led this movement as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradyumna. Thank you, Pradyumna. That was a very insightful talk, frankly speaking. And you have wonderfully highlighted some of the contradictions of Gandhi's own self, including when he's talking about language. On the one hand, he's championing education in the I don't like using the term vernacular myself, indigenous local languages. And at the same time, he's also saying that going back to ancient languages like Sanskrit is not what we should do, because technically it's not a living language, it's a dead language in that sense, because he himself read Bhagavad Gita in English, as you said. So I guess he was not totally against English, probably, but he was championing that, and this is something myself as a pedagogue, as an education person, a lot of scholars have keep talking about early education in mother tongue, and there's huge amount of scientific evidence also to show the wisdom of it, whether it is English or any other language. Early education in mother tongue is something which is highly advocated by academics and scientists. But the thing is that, I really, one thing struck me personally. I would ask our ACU colleagues and all of you also to comment. On the one hand, with regards to language, once again, I like the way you brought this thing about passion and emotion in language versus logic and rational language. His very autobiography, My Experiments with Truth, sounds like it's very much about logic and rational thinking, because he's talking about experimenting, okay, like in a laboratory, like a scientist, right? At the same time, through your reading, you're saying that he's constantly talking with the language of emotion and passion versus logic and rational thinking. So could you please, explain this thing a little bit? Because frankly speaking, I personally am finding it quite difficult to understand. Thank you. And any other thoughts on this, or any related question? Anybody? Can he respond to this, and then maybe? Yeah.
Like similarly, on the lines that you asked in the question, so how logical would it be to apply? How logical would it be to apply those Gandhian philosophies, especially given the contradictions and the continuous evolution today? So today, reasoning with emotion or reasoning with logic are two very different things and can be taken in two very different ways in the way we communicate. So would when addressing probably a conflict, or when trying to impart Gandhian values, should we approach it with Gandhian emotion and passion, or should we approach it with Gandhian logic?
Thank you. Thank you.
There is, I totally agree with what you said, but the simple caveat that Gandhi constantly give us is that on the question of autobiography is the agenda. Most of the Gandhian literature where Gandhi is writing intuitively. Uh, like out of the 100 volumes that we have, we can say 80% of it is sort of a reaction, right? So let's say a letter comes and reads it, and then he writes it, at that very particular point. But when he's writing his autobiography, there is an agenda, and he also says that I'm writing for other people to read my life, because all autobiographical accounts are such, whether it's Gandhi's or Mein Kampf or any other piece that you're reading which is an autobiography. That means the parts, and it's a literary exercise of a different kind, that when you want your life to be presented in front of someone, how honest it can be, right? And what are the elements that you want to bring? What are the structures that you can see? Another parallel autobiography, if you see, which is a person who has always addressed things in emotion and passion and has termed himself as Gandhian, but a lot of people don't believe it. The name of the person is Khushwant Singh. And even if you look at his two biographies, three, I guess, one at the age of 60, 80, and perhaps 100, simply not dying, in his own words. So, there is a particular agenda which has been attached, and once you have an agenda or a roadmap of things that you want to communicate, because it's very structured, right? It's chronological, right? And at the same time, some of the letters, it's not that all the letters are addressed like that. Some of the letters where there is a deep thought. And the reason is that when you go through the literature, sometimes it's written that do not publish this. And somewhere when the letter has been written, he is very keen on says that make sure that this is published. Right? So he is constantly aware of that, what needs to go in the public and or stays in the private domain. But at the same time, by Gandhi's own account, that he doesn't believe in what is public or private. Let's take the same, because it's a contemporary, the recent literature that has come to us is Gandhis Diary, that especially around the time when Gandhi was in Aga Khan Palace. So Manuben was strictly instructed that she should write her diary and list all the activities, right? And then Gandhi, being a journalist himself, would call that diary and go through that diary meticulously and then suggest edits and then sign and counter-sign on that diary. Now, so that diary isn't like sort of a product. And we do have the original manuscript as well, not just the one which is published, right? So if you look at the kind of things there, Gandhi wanted to go outside and not outside, because the moment he dons that hat of, of a publisher, right, or a journalist, right, he makes things, to be read by the others, right, or while responding. But in a personal communication, he'll always make sure that it's always about the, so Gandhi forced himself to be a reasonable and a logical person. A good example is Hind Swaraj, right, where Gandhi adopted a different way of writing altogether, where there is, a person who is questioning and, then the reader, right? So Gandhi is, making or, trying to go into these literary or inventing these styles, right? Just so that sometimes the message is conveyed, in a logical and a, in a reasonable way. And that's where Gandhi is forcing himself. That's not his natural way. And we all perhaps force ourselves, who generally don't belong from a, let's say, Western tradition or the West. We always force ourselves from that. I mean, it's a personal anecdote. I mean, I was doing my master's at University of Warwick, and there were decent enough grades, and there's always my feedback from my professors used to be, it's a very passionate engagement, and I used to think that it's a good thing. I think perhaps after 4 years or 3 years staying in UK, I realized that it isn't a good thing. Perhaps it was a very British politeness that, so, as you do your turn in your essays or dissertation, it should be dispassionate. I mean, that dispassion, objectiveness ought to be there. So for Gandhi, I mean, that wasn't the case, right? So that's the first bit. By answering your question, how do we put logic into the emotion or being rational while being passionate? It's a tough one because then it requires a different set of expression, a completely new vocabulary in which we ought to communicate. So for Gandhi, this language is, so when Gandhi is communicating to the other, right, and Gandhi and self and other are completely different from what philosophical binaries are. So he's constantly being aware of this thing and is constantly saying that I can feel it, I know, but I can't communicate, because if I communicate, they ought to be in a logical and rational way, but that's not what I mean, right? So, and we all have that language. It's not that language comes from Gandhi. We all have that intuitive language within yourselves. I mean, the best example is if you are stuck, if you are having a fight with your significant other, right? You all know what ought to be communicated during a spousal fight or during the shouting matches, but why they result into a violent shouting matches is because although you're communicating very rationally and logically, but then still you say that there is a communication divide, and how that happens because the emotion and the passion isn't flowing through the language that you are using, right? So Gandhi would be open to that. I mean, you can school Gandhi about polyamory, he'll be completely all right, right? But he needs to be schooled, and Gandhi always said that, yes, I'm up for it, right? Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Please. Could you please introduce yourself and then ask the question? Yeah, sure. I think no, because they're recording the session.
Hello. Yeah, hi, sir. It was a really good talk. Really enjoyed it. My name is Shubham. I hail from Guwahati, Assam. So I had a question, and this is something that has been bothering me for quite a while now. And it's about like the framework. So when Gandhi talks about a lot of things, I think the framework so Gandhi talks about engagement, right? And when he talks about engagement, I think the framework of the oppressor and the oppressed has to be similar. So for example, someone like Fanon will go ahead and then argue, or someone like Ambedkar as well, that when the framework is not available, for example, when Ambedkar critiques casteism in Annihilation of Caste or Riddles of Hinduism, he goes ahead and says that when that framework is not available, how does the oppressed actually engage with the oppressor? And therefore, what they need to resort to is something which is not based on engagement or like verbal engagement, or which is not based on certain norms which Gandhi said that we should follow, right? The non-violent frameworks of engagement. So therefore, what I wanted to ask, like, if you had pondered upon it, that sometime, that what would Gandhi's response be to that, especially to Fanon and to Ambedkar as well, in terms of when that framework is not available, when that framework is not accessible?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I think this is the question that is not just bothering you. I think it's been bothering me ever since I read Gandhi's autobiography, when one of my best friend gifted me in I think 9th standard. And I've given it a thought, and a very genuine thought, and I can't promise an answer, but I can promise you an answer that works for me, right? So that I'm not disturbed, right? So let me give you like two hypothetical situations. If you walk up to Dalai Lama and say that that what needs to be done with regard to the ISIS situation in the Middle East, can you guess what Dalai Lama's response would be? His response would be, okay, let's sit and talk. Right? Now, why do you think this is problematic? Precisely your question that framework didn't exist. Now for Gandhi, he is simply saying that we ought not to bother about the framework. right? Like a question that was held to Gandhi and said that, what do you think about, the Western civilization, the Renaissance, the way the intellectual tradition has been developed, how society has started to reorganize itself, the labor relations. So it's a very complex question that is put to Gandhi, where he's supposed to address the West, which has already became an idea because we're talking about, in the middle of World War II, right? It's the Westphalian system. So there isn't, a conceptualization of the West at that time, right? Gandhi's response to that in a very feeble voice, it might have been a good idea, right? Now, do you see how much he is dismissive of the entire civilizational development or growth? I mean, suit your word, but, so in this context, he's not bothered about that what is, he's just stick to only one thing, and that is the truth. And for Gandhi, the truth is the God. So when Gandhi is engaging with Ambedkar, right, he's saying that I don't care how you allot or put this, if you reserve the seats in an electorate, so you don't reserve the seats in the electorate, right? My problem is the same. My problem is that, to educate and tell people the truth that there shouldn't be a communal problem, right? There shouldn't be violence related to caste, right? So he's speaking in single dimension, right? So first of all, he's not aware of all this. The reason why is that perhaps he's even aware of he's ignoring them consciously by saying that all that doesn't matter. He's saying that is too much of a philosophical burden on oneself. If we just hold on to the truth, I mean, that should do the trick. He's saying that, dude, just keep it simple. Right? Anything else? Yeah.
So my question is also in relation to talking about drawing. Okay, I'm Nadine Tim from Ashesi University in Ghana. Yes, so there's respect. And one of the major challenges I think I've faced in my time as a student leader is being able to address situations logically and sometimes emotionally and passionately as well. So I really want to understand where do you draw the line between making a very logical decision as a student leader and making a passionate one too? Because I have been in situations where I have to communicate between a student body and let me say the administration. The administration is looking at the problem logically. Students are feeling the impact of the problem they are going through. So how do you bring these two things together? Thank you.
Yeah. So very good question. I don't know if I have answer to this question, but something that has worked through the Gandhian lens is, again, it's the same thing. He's saying it that truth doesn't have logic or rational. I mean, at some point, Gandhi derives a lot of its philosophical leanings from a Jaina tradition, and it's called Syadvad. And that's where Gandhi is saying that even in terms of truth, it cannot be one truth, and it cannot be addressed. So it has 6 or 7 variations, a particular truth. The first truth is, let's say he'll say it's a universal truth. The second, he'll say it's maybe true, maybe false. The third one is it's true, but I would like it to be false. The fourth one is false, but it's false, but it's true, right? So he's, while he's, grappling with this idea of truth, I mean, and he's saying, accrediting the same level to the God, that whether God exists or not, it's true, it's false, it's maybe true, maybe false, right? So while you're addressing an issue in let's say in a Gandhian language where one side is very passionate, the other side is logical, the Gandhi would say that there's only one side, and that side is of the truth. Now, if it comes out in a passionate fervor to the authorities, the best thing they do is to be logical. I mean, look at all the, I'm a lawyer by training. If you look at all the, legal dramas that we have, even the shows that we have at that point, if you look at the art of examination and cross-examination, where people are trying to speak their truth, but from the side of the power or from the side of the administration, the truth holds no value until and unless it has been classified into logical and rational, fold. And I think the problem starts in the way our education is there, because we trace perhaps everything back to Aristotle or Plato, right? And that's where there's a reason why Plato doesn't consider love as a thing, because it's as simple as that, because it's not rational, it's not, because love isn't rational, love isn't logical, right? And for Gandhi, perhaps, as one of my teachers used to say, that justice is the same. It's that intuitive thing. Justice can't be rational or logical. So what are we doing here in that process of talking, interacting with as a student leader with your own comrades and presenting the same thought to the administration? He'll constantly say that while you're speaking the language of love, I'm just juxtaposing it with justice, right? It should always be what you believe in. Let them classify in what it is. But you should know your version of truth, right? And stick to your version of truth. Doesn't matter if it is emotional, if it is not getting into those classification of being. I mean, just how things are ontologically in front of us. Is completely denying that and says that there's just one truth. I don't know if I answered that question.
Pradyumna, I just wanted to make one comment here. I guess what you are suggesting, let the students speak their language of passion, and of course the administrators will speak their language of logic and rational thinking. So then each one of them will keep speaking their own language. Then what would be the role of the student leader at the time, or the mediator who is trying to mediate between these two groups? And I think what you mentioned, if in a situation like this, if Dalai Lama would be asked what he would say, probably what Gandhi would also say. That's why probably he had so many roundtable meetings, that let's talk it out. Let's have a dialogue. Let's have a conversation with each other to understand each other's perspectives of truth. And as he said, it's not, truth is not singular, it's plural, as he perceived. So let's have a dialogue, and through the dialogue, let's discover each other's truth, where they're coming from. So I think as a student leader, probably that's what, or as a mediator, as a leader, that's the key role I think you can play. If you would...
I mean, I was just reading this in the morning where there are like two situations in front of Gandhi where he receives a letter from Gujarat College regarding the strike, and another letter that he gets on the same day is about a strike that is going on in an Annamalai University in south of India. So Gandhi is saying that, first of all, he said he was against the strike, but he said that he's in full possession of facts in Gujarat, and he supports the strike because there was nothing wrong done from the side of the students. So he said that yes, the strike should be there, and he says that and in both the instances, he highlighted the responsibility of the student leader. And he said that the student leader should present, first of all, should be aware of all material facts. And that particular leader, so, he's saying that the conversation between the management, right, which obviously at that time is very colonial, and we all can, juxtapose it in our post-colonial world, that how, we always try to, when we are talking about the language of oppression, the other always become the colonial, right? So here what Gandhi is saying, that it shouldn't be the crowd which should speak to the authorities, and it's very clear that it's the representation in form of that one student leader should go there and talk, right? And that's where the thing is, that it's very difficult to get that language, that what kind of language that a student leader would talk in. But it also is not saying that because there are plural voices, so that those plural voices need to be presented to, to the administration as it is. Otherwise, because there is that coding and decoding of message from what you are and how you are. Even if the leader doesn't believe in a lot of messages that ought to come, and people try to, let's say, if mellow down or try to reword it in their ways, and perhaps the message is lost, right? So that's where he's saying that it's the responsibility of the leader to communicate as things are, right? Because there can be different versions of truth, but the truth is, if some words are spoken, if they are represented verbatim, that becomes that temporal or episodic truth in that context. So Gandhi is facing within the student community, a lot of responsibility on the student leaders and their leadership, right? Which ought to be a social one. He's constantly saying that I don't want students to engage in power politics or electoral politics. It ought to be only social.
There are many questions raising hands around the room. Yes. Can we quickly get the questions? We also have our ACU colleagues here sitting. I'm looking at the watch, and they have some things to say. But quickly, all of you, those who raised your hands, just share quickly, introduce yourself and share what you had to say. And then we'll see if Pradyumna is going to maybe come back a little later after. Okay, all right. Okay, sounds good, sounds good. Okay, please go ahead.
My name is Babalo. I'm from South Africa. I think for me, I was intrigued by the part where you said Gandhi encouraged student strikes in some instances. And given the history of our country, I think it comes from there. A lot of times, actually right now at the beginning of the year, many times where students get to be heard is through protests. And it tends to be violent most of the time. Like last year in our institution, we lost a student due to protest. And some people get injured and property gets destroyed. The same property that they're going to use for their education gets destroyed. So I'm just asking, like, if there's anything, how can we work as student leaders to, how can we work to improve maybe the conditions of the students in the institution or whatever needs they have without involving strikes, because it really, really gets violent. On the other hand, I'm actually part of the Postgraduate Association where we are representing the postgraduate students. We work a little bit differently from the Students' Representative Council, which usually use protests and strikes to get heard. We are a bit more formal. We send emails, we arrange meetings with the administration of the universities to get things done. But many times when you do, a lot of things don't really get to be done. We don't get to be heard. But with the SRC, then it gets to be heard, or the classes will be cancelled, or a lot of that because of the strikes, because there's fear that there will be violence. But with us, where we are trying to be more civil and more professional in doing things, we won't get things done. So how can we try to find a way that we don't get to destroy things or hurt people in order to get things done?
Other hands raised? Yes.
I'm Riddhi Vishwanathan again from the University of Manchester. I just wanted to make a very quick comment because thank you so much for that insightful talk. I think I'm confident and assured that I can have an answer back and take away a solid answer back to the University of Manchester. So, to give you a very quick context of the question that I raised and why I wanted to know your opinions on the controversy surrounding Gandhi's life, is because celebrating Gandhi's 150th anniversary, we wanted to unveil a statue of Mahatma Gandhi at the University of Manchester. And while we were doing this, along with other Indian associations, we had a lot of challenges in unveiling that very statue due to the controversies. But I think we nevertheless went and did it just to echo the principles that you spoke about, which is tolerance. Gandhi himself was the icon for tolerance, and he engaged in constructive criticism and constructive conversation. So it's kind of reassured me that it was right for us to have that statue, because today, going back, if Gandhi were to be alive, there are so many things that he has changed, and we should give importance to that evolution, like all of us evolve. So thank you.
All right. Okay, so my name is Adam Vernon. I'm from Jamaica. The area that I would like to probe your mind on is really on education and the way how its importance is being pushed now in our society. However, I remember this morning in the welcome address, the speaker made us aware of the seven, I think it said the seven sins of Gandhi. And the one that stuck out to me was the one that said, where you talked about knowledge without character. And in our society now, where we have children growing up without the conditions or the society that helps them to build a proper character, and yet we are educating them, and sometimes with weaponization of misinformation or false knowledge, how do you think that Gandhi would address student leaders to help to bridge the gap between knowledge and character in these times?
Hi, I'm Timon Nürnberger of the University of Malta. I just have two quick questions, and the first one would on how Gandhi would reconcile some of the focus on religious education. How would he reconcile this focus for non-religious people, especially given that in the Western world, people increasingly become secular or irreligious, and how would he justify the education being given in the non-local language, given that Sanskrit, Arabic, Hebrew, or Greek are the respective original languages of the sacred texts?
University of Ilorin, Nigeria. I want to make reference with respect to the one you mentioned on students engaging in politics or strike. For instance, like what my colleague said, in my country, protest now is a felony offense. So as a student leader, when you are trying to bring in the issue of dialogue with administration, with management, and at the same time, you are trying to avoid going to protest. So how do you balance the two? Because it's now becoming a crime within the country, and that's the only language the management understands. If you don't go to strike, or if you don't go to protest, they will not listen to you. And even if at all you go into heat, it can also lead to violence. And in another aspect too, most of the student leaders have been influenced by the so-called management, by the so-called politics. And then when some sets of students are not trying to move out of it, it becomes a crime to them. So how do you balance the two as a student leader and at the same time trying to speak the voice of the people to the management?
Hello, my name is Parth Parekh. I'm a student here at Jindal University. My question is, you said that Gandhi promoted the idea that students shouldn't engage in politics or except in the social sphere, and should read more. My question is then the topic arises of what should the students read. Now there was a very big debate in India about the NCERT promoting certain religious histories and infringing on others. Similarly, like I'm a student here at law school, and for example, for the past 2 years, the cases we read, they're of 1900s or 1950s, which are not exactly relevant in today's times. So how do you decide what a student should read? As you said that even if the teacher is immoral, the student should look for the morality in the reading. So like, what does Gandhi say about that?
Okay, you and then you. Yes, please. The and then you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jocelyn from Zambia.
Okay.
I heard you talk about women, so my question is based on that. I come from a place where it's not so common for a woman to be in leadership. So being a leader at my
Where
school...
are you coming from?
Zambia. Yeah, so being in the students' union at my school, it's actually quite dangerous because certain women are raped for being in such a position. So my question is, how would you help or assist us curb that situation?
Thank you. Next, you, please.
Okay, my question is like you said that political space is not suitable for student. Gandhiji said that, but in my opinion is that nowadays whenever we are seeing the politicians and stuff like that, they are more than 50 to 60 years old and they are making the policies of like 15-year-old boys and stuff. So what do you think that? In my opinion, I think that students should be connected with the political views. They should know that what is happening, and they should like take their point of view, like what should happen and what should we have to maintain to like what should we like put into our society so that we can have a better future. So my question is that like political space is not suitable for student, but is that any way that student can learn and also have some sort of political view towards our society? Thank you.
Next.
So as okay, I'm Muqtasim Islam Nirjan, and I'm coming from IUBAT, International University of Business, Agriculture and Technology in Bangladesh. As I'm a scout and I'm a student leader at my university, so I have faced the same situation as Nadine said, and Sir has also answered it. But I have the question that when I have faced the same situations, I have understood the situation the students are facing, and I had also understood the logics the administrations are giving. So how can I like in our country, every country has a different aspect or different background. So in our country, how can we like, how can I or the student leaders who are standing in between the students and administration, understanding the both sides, so how can we solve the situation? Like,
This is something we already, I think, addressed, in terms of, it's always helpful to bring people together to talk, right? To have a dialogue. And I think that's what the Gandhian method is, also something Pradyumna has highlighted. But I would really request my colleague Pradyumna to quickly address all your concerns. I think there is a confusion around this room regarding whether Gandhi actually thought student strikes are okay, whether he supported or he did not. There seems to be a confusion among the room. So first I would request Pradyumna to clarify that and then address your the issues that you've raised.
Okay, I'll quickly address each of the question, but I'll keep it to minimum. For further explanations, we can perhaps meet outside the room, but I'll just try to like highlight that in which direction we ought to talk. First of all, Gandhi very explicitly has said it time and again that he don't trust students, and And the reason why he says that, wherever there has been a student politics, there has been violence, and that's why he don't trust students, right? And there is a reason why he is constantly saying to keep the students outside the political space. But at the same time, Gandhi never said that the student ought not to have a political view, but is constantly saying that students need to have their own political view, but not an engagement and action on it when it comes to power politics, right? So we understand sort of that the age is, a lot of leaders are 50s and 60s, but they're saying the moment, because he's saying that political activities take a lot of time, and Gandhi is saying here, as a politician, that it consumes a lot of time. So if they're, consumed in the power politics of things, they're going to miss out the time on reading, right? So I think that's what Gandhi says. I think I can clarify it more, but I think I should move on. Also, Gandhi didn't had a good experience in Manchester when he visited for the first time, because of he was saying that the cloth needs to be homespun, and he wasn't welcomed in Manchester very much when he went there, I think by road on his visit to London. But it's interesting that how, because I think in UK there is a politics of statue, and that generally comes from the kind of statues you have in front of the parliament. And very interestingly, people say that it's the first Gandhian statue in the London. I think there's one already in Tavistock Square way before. I was surprised when I was in London. That's the first place, like I came out of the Euston station and straight to the first proper garden that I saw, and I said, oh, it's a Gandhi statue here, right? So it's, at that level, it's a completely different sort of politics, and Gandhi was very much against the statue himself, and he repeatedly said over and over again. Then on the question of knowledge and character, now Gandhi has changed his views about what an education with the character means, and mostly while he's trying to address this question and couple both the questions and answer them together, that when he's talking about character, he's hinting towards a religious education in terms of spirituality. But going on to the language bit, he's saying that you ought not to be a linguist. So if you're a linguist, it's okay for you to pursue languages and then discover. And then you tell the other people that what you have discovered in the respective language. But that language of spirituality, and especially how it's received generally in West, because here the Gandhi is mostly influenced by Vivekananda and his view, how an Indian, or let's say an indigenous person, goes to the West and talk to people in a place, let's say America, where the religion is almost declining. So Gandhi said that you need to find that language where it's a language of religion, but more of not religion, but it's a language of spirituality, less of religion. So I think Gandhi adopts the same method which Vivekananda adopted in 1893 when he visits Chicago and the World Parliament of Religions, and he became an absolute hit. I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of Indian philosophers becomes hit in West is they talk of religion but yet quite not talk about it, right? And that trick is sort of lies in spirituality, where you invoke the religion, but it's not the religious feeling. I mean, you can see, there's an American example that how we have completely different ways of addressing in religious terms when it comes to Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. I mean, they're completely two different sets of language, but religious nonetheless, right? So that sticking to that spirituality. Now, when it comes to protest, the scene has changed, because at that time the protest, students were also the party of the protest. Now, the sad reality is that the only protesting party that we have in our political space are the students, right? So, and there is this change, and we have to acknowledge it, and perhaps that's where we have to sort of go a step ahead by using what Gandhi has said. And Gandhi would have said that, yes, it's okay. And here Gandhi would have again gone to that extent of saying that yes, physical sacrifice is the only way. So this idea of disobedience there is he's not saying that, if the law is immoral, let's say, of about the protest, if you're getting, arrested, Gandhi would simply say, yes, if there is a law, even if you don't want to protest, but if there is a law saying that there ought not to be a protest, it's a good enough reason to protest, right? And it says, and what happens if you protest? Will you be beaten? Right? So he'll say that, okay, they can beat your physical body, they can abuse your physical body, right? But they can't take the truth from you. So he's okay. So Gandhi is all up for his physical suffering. See, that's what I'm saying. What are Gandhi's tantrums? So the moment if truth is not conveyed, he say, I'm going on an hunger strike, right? It's not suffering of someone else. It's sort of a self-suffering to make sure that the other person feels that love or guilt because of self-suffering. He's not, instilling that suffering to someone else. He's suffering himself, right? Or, the same goes in the Salt March where Gandhi's, is being arrested for, violating the salt law. So it's not that he's saying that let us disobey the law. Civil disobedience is about disobeying the law, but it's not disobeying the law per se, but disobey the immorality of the law as it exists, right? So similarly, if we have a ban on protest, Gandhi would say that, yes, I'll go to protest and I'll go jail for that, because that for me is immoral and that ought to be protested. So I think the space has changed, right? And the reason for that is perhaps because of the state agencies, depending upon wherever you are. I mean, even in, when I say West, I don't mean Europe, I say the West, where, the influence is through certain procedures. So what is Gandhi is saying that, what Gandhi would say, perhaps, I don't know, I can't say that authoritatively, but because of the change in political scene where the only party in, even in political and social space are students, right? I think it comes down to students to engage in that. But Gandhi says that even if that's the case, when he's talking about Gujarat, few of the universities and strikes there, he says that make sure that your classes are not suffered, make sure that, whatever is sort of bare minimum that you ought to do within a university setup. So he's giving that extra value to that process. Maybe two reasons. First, perhaps because they don't trust students, and second, it says that if you're too involved or engaged in the power politics, anti-governmental politics as a student, you will end up reading more, or perhaps you'll regret later in your life that you should have been a better student to understand the things. So the Gandhian appeal is, as a student, how they can engage socially. They should appeal to all the working people who are not a student to come to the protest and talk. So the people who says that, oh, you are students, you belong in the university, say the honest answer should be that yes, we belong in the university and you belong on the street. You're not there because we are there, right?
Thank you very much, Pradyumna, and thank you particularly for highlighting that the kind of student protests we have been seeing, where often it gets violent and actually hurt other people, something which Gandhi would have never endorsed. He would always talk about civil disobedience and protest against unjust laws or rules and things like that, but through always a non-violent passive resistance mode, not to create a really violent protest where your actions are going to hurt anybody else. He would rather let himself get hurt rather than hurting someone else. So thank you for highlighting those, and also situating Gandhi within his historical and cultural context with regards to the religious issue that Tom raised over there. I would now like to really invite, we are running over time, but it's okay. We can 15 minutes. My colleague here from ACU, Amy Longland, very even after long delayed flight. I'm really impressed to see how fresh you look, and you're still not sleepy. So over to Amy.
Thank you. No, I still am very sleepy, but I'm powering on. That was a really interesting discussion. Just for clarity, I'm from the Commonwealth Secretariat. We work really closely with the ACU, but I'm the Countering Violent Extremism unit, as I kind of said earlier. So I'll probably talk a lot more about this tomorrow in the session in the afternoon. But I just had a few points I wanted to make about what you guys fed back and your questions, which I thought were really, really interesting. And thank you for your really comprehensive responses. I was scribbling away as well, because it's something that's really interesting and it does apply to the work that we do. But my knowledge, I must confess, wasn't as in-depth as yours is on Gandhian philosophy and things like that. I think I just have a few points I want to make. Is what we often say in the CVE unit, and what's really, really important is radicalization or extreme views isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that's really important. So students generally are more inclined to have more extreme views on things, or might act in a more radical manner to achieve their aims. That doesn't mean that's wrong, and actually people should have a right to do that. And who is a terrorist or violent extremist, and I'll talk more about these terms tomorrow, is actually a matter of perspective a lot of the time, as we know. So, an example that pops into my head is the suffragette movement in the UK. A lot of the women that took part in that were considered quite radical. They were doing radical things to achieve their being disruptive, but they weren't violent extremists in the way that we think today. And I think it's really important to try and look at that point at which, when do people who have extreme views or radical views, when do they then become violent extremists? And is it that breakdown between the administrative bodies and those that are trying to have a voice and trying to make themselves heard? And that's why I think the whole idea of student protests then becoming violent is quite interesting as well. So that's kind of what we try and work on as well, is protecting an individual's right to have a radical point of view. And making sure that those points of view have a platform to be heard without, and therefore, I suppose, preventing them from becoming a violent extremist with, looking to achieve, the attention that they want to their kind of grievances by, causing harm to others. Another interesting thing I picked up from the discussions was the idea that can Gandhi as a philosopher be applied to modern times, and I think definitely he can. And this discussion today has shown me that it's multifaceted, his influence, but anything can be applied today. I mean, democracy is as old as the ancient Greeks, and things like that are really, really important. And every figure who has been influential has been controversial. But I think what's really important about Gandhi and his philosophy is this idea of non-violence, and actually understanding why people might act the way that they do through dialogue, through other means. What drives people to think, act and behave in a certain way. And he said something, I made a note of it, but I probably won't be able to find it now. He basically says that every conflict is kind of two levels, persons and principles, and actually it's just a conflict of two very different worldviews, and that can actually be applied to a lot of violent extremism today. So it's about unpicking why these extremists might have these views, and what are the factors, I'll talk a little bit about push-pull factors tomorrow, but why are they acting that way, and how can we mitigate those factors, and therefore reduce those that environment conducive to violent extremism. So I think, just to kind of wrap up, because we've all been talking, and it's been really great to hear you guys actually really interacting and engaging. So I just think what I think is really important with Gandhi, maybe I'm taking a slightly simplified view of his beliefs, but his 5 pillars I was reading about, respect, understanding, acceptance, appreciation and compassion. Those values actually underpin the Commonwealth Secretariat as well. That's in our charter and what we believe in, and I think that can be applied to all the different scenarios that have been brought up today. How do student leaders interact? How can you build that understanding? And also, when we look at that step forward from actually just having a radical point of view and then actually becoming a radical extremist who's going to enact something violent. How can we use those 5 pillars as well to, you know, really mitigate that environment, and how can we all work together? So a bit of a side tangent there, but yeah, those are my kind of thoughts on the discussion.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you. I would now like to invite Faye Taylor from the ACU, Association of Commonwealth Universities, to wrap up this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, and it is just a couple of minutes from me to try and tie some of this together and then look forward to what we're coming to. I've also really enjoyed the discussion this morning, and I think it's a reminder, so universities are a privileged place for debate, honest and frank discussion, disagreement, but also truth-seeking. And it's one of the reasons, again, that we feel universities themselves need to have forums like this, both on campus and internationally, to be able to open up those sorts of debates and answer some of the trickier questions that have come forward. I've noted that one of the issues that many countries have sort of flagged is the need to find a way of interacting between student protest movements and formal structures. And I'm struck by a conversation we had last year with one of the early leaders of the Fees Must Fall campaign in South Africa, who's now hosting roundtables with ministers in South Africa, because she's also a lawyer by background and accepts that, you know, the voice was heard, and now there is a need to engage with a process in which change can happen, because at some point the discussion needs to mature, and I think we've had examples of other ways of student protest as well. But I also wanted to flag the fact this isn't just about student protest sort of against an administration or in opposition to something. As I said earlier on, this is about student leadership for any social challenge or global challenge. So actually I was really particularly struck by the conversations around rational versus passionate engagement and debate, because actually a lot of the social issues that you spoke about this morning and that I know you work on they have to be about passion. This has to be about inspiring people, and you know, the reason that you might pick a particular initiative to run is because you feel personally about improving the world on that front. And so I really like the fact that we were able to have a discussion around all of those things. And you know, when we started this series, it was the 150th anniversary year last year of Mahatma Gandhi's birth, and so and hence why the 3 countries that we've started this series in. But obviously we go to each country and draw on the expertise of each university host. So obviously OP Jindal Global University have the Mahatma Gandhi Centre for Peace, and the workshops that you'll be doing over the next 2 days are sort of, again, very interactive, but based on some of the principles which we think go beyond the man himself. So I'm really glad that we were able to have a conversation, and we can continue having a conversation about controversy. This was never going to be about sort of big man history. I'm a historian by background. I was smiling when you were saying that you didn't necessarily think it was good to write passionate essays. I always gave higher marks to my undergraduates who gave passionate essays. Not always easy about I was a medieval historian, so not always easy about some of the subjects, but I read the most incredible essay I ever read was on the Magna Carta and on the importance of democracy. So it is really important that we capture, I think, both sides of this, and it's a great debate that we're having. And I think we have established the foundations for going forwards in terms of using this structure, having a framework now to talk to each other, thinking about principles, and then extrapolating it to our individual circumstances and thinking how we can work together. So great debate, and thank you so much. It's been really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye, for wonderfully wrapping up this discussion. We have, I think it's high tea time, right? And where is it? Okay, just right across. So we will convene again in this room at 4:30. Okay.